and then she's denying this poor conservative man his right to smoke and drink Mountain Dew. So memes would have come out immediately, and a lot of them would have been probably attacking the report, very likely. Probably would have seen some fake videos. This is one that I invented. This is not a real video. I just screen captured some stuff from YouTube and created it. But you might have seen things like this, very similar to the kind of fake videos that were done about Planned Parenthood, about Acorn, which was basically defunded because of a fake video. You certainly would have seen that, I'm sure. You would have seen tweets, and these are invented tweets. I made these up using some tweet faking software, and you probably would have had people from the alt-right saying, what's the government getting in our business for? They're taking away our rights, blah, blah, blah. They're against men, you know, smoking's a man thing, they're trying to take it away from us. You might have had people who were pro-legalized marijuana, seeing this as some kind of a government attempt to keep weed illegal. You know, they're attacking smoking, so they're attacking pot, right? And then you might have seen the 24-hour news cycle chiming in. This is, again, I made this one up. This is not a real headline, but with a relative degrees of fairness and balance, you can imagine how CNN and MSNBC and Fox and all these other people, Handley and Combs and Bill O'Reilly and Rachel Maddow, might have reacted to the Surgeon General's report. So, again, thinking about this as alternative history. One of the things that happened in 1964 that would happen in our current world was the people with money interests immediately lashed out and did everything they could to quash the report. Philip Morris was not having any of this Surgeon General's report. And they, as everybody probably knows from knowing the history of tobacco, they spent a lot of money over the years trying to fight the science of the Surgeon General's report, trying to fight efforts to curb tobacco smoking. And that happened in 1964 with every media they could get their hands on, and it certainly would happen today. You could imagine an AstroTurf Roots campaign of outraged citizens defending their rights that was being paid for by Philip Morris and all these other people who have huge money interests in tobacco. So in the alternative history, what would have been really tragic was, you can imagine Lyndon Johnson is new as President of the United States. He's got Vietnam bubbling up. He's trying to fight the war on poverty. He's worried about civil rights. And suddenly he's got this tobacco fiasco on his hands. As president, he might have said, you know what, let's just put this on the back burner. Let's not get into this fight right now. I got too much going on. And maybe this room would have a haze of smoke and there'd be ashtrays everywhere, and we'd still be smoking like it was 1965. And that would be really sad. In 1964, it was a peak year for smoking. 42% of the people, adults in the United States smoked. Today it's about 18%. That's really amazing. And it would have been a real, I think, almost anyone would agree. Maybe there's some dissidents out there somewhere, but most people would agree that was a real public health victory, and it's a good thing. You know, from a personal standpoint, I remember the Kennedy assassination, I remember the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, and I remember about 1967 or 68, my dad quit smoking, and I remember that he outlived all his brothers and brothers-in-laws who didn't by decades. It was an important thing. So, alternate history aside, I wanted to now talk about some of the terminology flying around. Now, one of the things that we need to be clear about is what is propaganda. A little bit different than fake news. I'm going to talk about fake news in a minute. But, you know, when we think of propaganda, very often your mind goes to, oh, the Nazis in the 20th century, the great masters of propaganda. Typically, you know, propaganda has a political purpose. It's trying to convince somebody to do something. It usually has a harmful purpose, although you probably find examples of helpful propaganda. People might say the anti-smoking campaign was helpful propaganda. Maybe, maybe not. But typically propaganda is different than just regular straightforward information in that there's a mix of truth, a little bit of truth with a lot of fake. So the Nazis, they love to talk about how terrible Jewish bankers were to Germany. Now, were there Jewish bankers in Germany before the Nazis? There certainly were. Were some of them very wealthy? Absolutely. Did some of them probably bend the rules a little bit? Hey, they were bankers. I'm sure they did. But almost everything they had to say about Jewish bankers, the Nazis had to say, was made up. It wasn't true. A little bit of truth, a lot of lies. And of course, propaganda is in the eye of the beholder. if this were a panel of an audience of skinheads out here, you might be going, well, that's not propaganda. They were telling the truth. You're living in a false world. Of course, the Germans were not the only people who did propaganda in the 20th century. It was pretty widespread. And propaganda is really old. This is an inscription, it's called the Behistun inscription. It's from about 515 BCE. And it's basically telling you about the huge victory of Darius the Great, who made Persia great again, and what a wonderful guy he was. And this is probably the oldest known written propaganda. We can imagine probably that oral propaganda existed before this time. And so it goes back a long way. We know the Romans had a lot of propaganda. It goes on through history. This is from 1598, and it's an engraving by Protestant Germans who had never been to the New World, depicting the atrocities of the Spanish in the New World. And it was anti-Catholic, anti-Spanish, and there was some truth to it. The Spanish were pretty brutal in the New World, but this was just really made up stuff. Other kinds of, what is propaganda? Is this cigarette advertisement propaganda? Some people would say yes. Going back to my smoking analogies, at the start of the 20th century, the per capita consumption of of cigarettes was 54 cigarettes a year. With the invention of machine-made cigarettes and vast advertising campaigns, print, radio, later TV, of course, product placement in films, by the peak year, again, 1965, 1964, the average consumption was 4,259 cigarettes a year. That's some pretty effective propaganda. It's partly the machinery made it possible, but it was also the propaganda of advertising. I wanted to share this one. This is a bit of propaganda from about the time of the Surgeon General's report. And I'm going to play this for you. I hope it plays.
Who walks the stair without a care and makes the happiest sound. Bounce up and down just like a clown. Everyone has its Slinky.
Did that actually play? Did you see the video? Okay, it didn't play on my machine. So when I was a kid, this commercial, strangely it was in black and white when I was a kid, on my parents' TV anyway. Everybody wanted a Slinky. And most of my friends got a Slinky at birthday, Christmas, whatever. I had a Slinky. Nobody I knew was actually able to make that damn thing go down the stairs. And basically you played it for 10 minutes and it turned into a tangled mess and you threw it away. That's a kind of advertising propaganda. They made us believe something was true by basically lying to us, and we bought it. So again, with propaganda, this is an example of a website called Natural News that I would consider propaganda. And again, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands or anything. Maybe some people in this room don't. There are a lot of people in this country who don't consider this propaganda, who think that Western medicine and scientific medicine is the propaganda, and this website is telling you the truth. And it's probably, for me to call it propaganda, yeah. Can I say for a fact that everything on this website is a lie and wrong? I can't. I haven't looked at all of it. I haven't checked it all out. Maybe there's some good information in here. Maybe not. And that's one of the things about propaganda. It's in the eye of the beholder. Again, the skinheads seeing the Nazi propaganda would not call it propaganda. And it's also nuanced. To what extent is it propaganda? To what extent was the Slinky ad lying to us? A lot, a little, hard to say. So the other side of the coin is the fake news. And there's a couple definitions of fake news. The one definition that we see tweeted a lot is anything that disagrees with my worldview is automatically fake news. And that's one definition. But the broader definition is the kind of thing we're seeing, which is basically the clickbait stuff that's done not for political purposes like propaganda, but it's done to make money, to get people to click on your site, and you're getting ad revenue for that. And it's also done for humor purposes. So on this example here, I've got some examples of clickbait. In the upper right-hand corner, there's a picture of Ivanka Trump, and it says, "You won't believe what Ivanka Trump does in the morning." Now, the person who wrote this could have totally made this up, probably doesn't have any stake in what Ivanka Trump does, doesn't care what we think Ivanka Trump does, doesn't care what these words actually say, as long as people click on that because they're going to get ad revenue. That's a very typical example of clickbait. They just want you to look at it. There's also clickbait for humor purposes, or fake news for humor purposes. The Onion is a great example of that. I'm sure everybody's familiar with that. And You've probably read stories about how articles in The Onion get picked up and passed off as true. People post it on Facebook. Even other news sources have picked up their articles and posted them as true. On the lower left there is a website for something called the Landover Baptist Church, and it looks like a real church website until you start looking at it, and it's actually a parody of evangelical Christianity. On the right is DHMO, which looks like a kind of a health scare website, until you stop and think DHMO is another word for water. It's a parody of scare websites. I would say, the difference between fake news and propaganda is that political purpose, but it's not always easy to detect. In the upper right-hand corner here, we've got a clickbait article, 15 celebrities who have converted to Islam. I believe that's Paris Hilton, I think, wearing some kind of a headscarf. And the person who wrote this might not have anything against Islam, might not have any problem with it, might not care about that. But you could see how this kind of article, even if it didn't have a political intent, could have a political effect. Somebody who was unhappy with Islam, uneasy with Islam, afraid of Islam, might look at this and go, oh, look at those Hollywood idiots, and just another sign that, Islam is ready to take over our country, where's my AR-15, So the intent there becomes very muddy. Again, a very nuanced thing between what's propaganda, what's fake news. Fake news, not that new. It predates the internet. The Weekly World News, I don't believe it exists anymore, but it used to show up in supermarkets, and it would just have crazy stories that nobody in their right mind would really believe. But the idea was they would either get people to buy it as a joke, or maybe some people believed it, but it was just kind of I think pretty much everybody was in on the joke of the Weekly World News. So the more outrageous article they can have, Elvis seen working in a gas station, you name it, they would print it to get people to read it, and basically to sell subscriptions or sell copies and to sell ads. But fake news is even older than that. This is an article from the New York Sun, April 13th, 1844. And it's really hard to see, but the big headline is astounding news. Atlantic crossed in 3 days, single triumph of Mr. Monk Mason's flying machine. This balloon, the Victoria, flew across the Atlantic in 75 hours. A whole big story about it, totally made up to sell papers and sell advertising, and the author was Edgar Allan Poe. So fake news isn't new. So propaganda isn't new, fake news isn't new. So the question is there anything new under the sun? And those of you who are familiar with the Sun, the British newspaper, it's a good example of fake news. I think there are some things that are new, that it's why this may be something that we want to address. The first thing is the volume of information. And these are some slides about the number of tweets and the number of YouTube videos and so on. And everybody in this room knows the internet caught on at some point in the 90s, early 2000s, and it's just taken off, and there's lots of information out there. So the amount of information you have to deal with today as opposed to 1964, many, many times greater. There's a lot of stuff out there. The volume is new. Also volume in the sense of the reach of information. This is a picture of somebody standing on a soapbox in Hyde Park Square. This person could be saying untrue things, but his audience is going to be anybody who's within the sound of his voice. Not a very large volume that he can project. He can't reach very many people. Okay, so of course the printing press came along, and that allowed people to print things and to distribute to a wider audience more broadly. Of course, that really started to matter a lot more when transportation improved. When you had railroads to move things around, you could really print a newspaper in London and have it all over the country before the end of the day. That was a big improvement in the volume that you could project. Because you had radio and television, which could reach millions of people potentially, because you had to have access. You had to be able to get on the radio, get on TV. Again, going back to 1964, most people in this country had 3 TV channels. At my house, we had 2 that we got. So getting on the radio, getting on TV, radio was certainly easier, but radio or TV was a challenge. Another source for distributing information that was really important for a while was the copy shop, not coffee shop, the copy shop. And I remember when I was in the 80s, I knew this guy who worked at the night shift at Kinko's in Boise. And at night, they didn't have many customers walking in. It was a 24-hour operation, so they would print out large batches